We're here in Stanford University with consultant, venture capitalist, and best-selling author, Geoffrey Moore. Geoffrey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here at the GSB, looking out the somewhat of a rainy window in your commodious studio here. Also looks like a study table, but very cool. That's very cool.
Geoffrey, innovation is a central theme of your books. How do companies, the best companies, become more innovative? And indeed, should most companies be trying to become more innovative?
Yeah, I think if we treat innovation is a neutral substance. So being more innovative is not necessarily the goal. The goal is to be more effective in an economic competition. So you want to achieve competitive advantage. In order to do that, you need to differentiate yourself strategically from your competitors. And in order to do that, you need to innovate. But the reason why that preamble is so important is innovation that does not lead directly to strategic differentiation from your competitive set actually doesn't get repaid, or at least it doesn't get repaid anywhere near as much. And so focusing innovation ends up being a big deal.
Out of all the, switching maybe from companies into technologies, out of all the big technology trends you've seen in the past decade or so, which have stood out to you as being the most impactful and powerful?
Yeah, so one of the things about innovation is just getting in the right category, right? So, because as categories go through the technology adoption life cycle, they have this huge ramp up. And so from an economic point of view, they create a lot of wealth, even if you're number 3 or 4 or 6 in the category. If you think about the impact,
so market trumps
category trumps company,
yeah,
and then niche market can create a position. If you're not winning the company battle, if you're not the gorilla, then a niche market, or what we call gorilla in the niche, is a way to be successful in a subset of the market. So category is the highest order bit, then company power, then market power, then offer power, and then program power. There's sort of a hierarchy of powers that we go down. So you're thinking about impactful technologies. That tends to be what categories have been the most impactful. And in my life, one stands up an order of magnitude higher, maybe more than that, than the others, and that is the internet. The internet in its largest sense, the web and all the stuff it's spawning. It feels like the Earth is self-wiring itself a nervous system. And in my lifetime, the first time, in my grandparents' lifetime, that happened with radio. And in my lifetime, it happened with TV, and particularly with CNN. That was a really interesting phenomenon. But what you've watched the world do, it's kind of like the Gaia hypothesis, right? You're watching the world become more conscious. And with the internet, it's become remarkably conscious and very responsive. So now it's like with TV, you got messages, but you couldn't do anything with them. You just were more receptive. In this environment, people are messing with everything all the time. And so it's all this interest in emergent and chaos in kind of a, emergent categories, all the properties of emergent systems, all this interest around that is because, well, I'm sure it was related to other things as well, but it's totally applicable to this phenomenon.
It's interesting that when we were talking about the most innovative technologies, you pick the internet, and previously we were talking about the most innovative companies. And the internet, of course, came out as a result of not really any company in particular, and a lot of the success of it has been built on open source.
Right.
Well, now you hosted a panel on open source, I think, last year. What are your thoughts on how and why the open source phenomenon has contributed so much to innovation?
It's interesting. So when we talk about innovation, we talk about this distinction we call core versus context. So core is that vector of innovation that you are going to strategically differentiate on. On that vector, you want to be proprietary, closed, secret. You're trying to create a barrier between you and the rest of the competitive set, and you're trying to steal a march on them, and you don't want them to know what you're doing. Every other form of innovation, however, which would help you become more productive, more effective, whatever, but it's not your differentiation vector, you would like to get for free. That's what we call context. So context are the non-differentiating areas of your business. Open source is a miraculous source of context resources. And so if you're Microsoft, you're very leery of it because unfortunately the open source is working on your strategic vector. But if you're IBM, you're showing SCORE. You know, this wasn't my strategic vector. I win, right? I think so that's one thing. That's from the economic point of view. The other thing is, we seem to oscillate as a culture, both in the U.S. and to some degree globally, between a pendulum of selfishness and altruism, or very highly competitive behavior and then collaborative behavior. And it turns out in most ecosystems, in Darwinian dynamics, both of those behaviors are rewarded, and they do tend to oscillate. You know, so in the 90s we had this highly competitive, very egoistic forms of competition. All the winners were hyper-competitive cultures. So it was Oracle, it was Microsoft, it was Intel, it was Sun, it was Cisco, and they were all just sort of meat-eating velociraptor kind of cultures. But you drive that so far, and you get to a point where the ecosystem says, I don't like these guys, I don't like what we're doing, I don't like this. And you get a generation of people that say, I'm not going to do that. And so, you know, even though the Google guys are making a fortune, the Google guys were very much in the spirit of, let's open this thing up, let's see what happens, let's trust in the world, let's be in the moment. You know, let's not have a game plan, except maybe our game plan is not to have a game plan, right? I mean, that, and let's let it happen in the YouTubes and the MySpaces and the Facebooks and all that kind of stuff. And so we're seeing right now this wave of collaborative interactions, and you know, it has its downsides too, right? I mean, I mean, the guy, you know, Jimmy Small's, I forget his last name, he's the guy who runs Wikipedia. He's you know, Wikipedia is becoming a bureaucracy, because ultimately anything taken to its logical extent finds its own contradictions and its own ways of limiting itself. But I still think we're on the collaboration vector for now, and so I think open source, therefore, two things. It's economically interesting as a source of context resources, and it's culturally or emotionally interesting as a collaborative enterprise.
So if Microsoft is a velociraptor, what's Google?
Well, yeah. So you know, stem cell, fetal stem cell. It's not quite sure what it is yet, right? I think it's because I think what's happening. Google most accurately right now is a hyper ambitious organism, and it has this extraordinary media property called search, and this very powerful monetizing capability called AdSense, and that's funding essentially an infinite number of research projects or experiments, of which it's not clear that any other ones are there yet, but the stock markets are still betting on it. Basically, Google's an option to be in a bunch of businesses that they aren't in, and which is kind of how we did valuation during the dot-com era, and we should be thoughtful about that, because it turned out those options were not anywhere near as valuable as people thought they were. And I think anybody of my age looks at anything that is as dynamic and as fast multiplying as Google, and we say, there's a time of reckoning. Having said that, there is no percentage to anticipating the time of reckoning. You know, this is not, you know, it's like when you're an adolescent, people tell you you're going through a phase. Yes, you are, and forget it. Mm-hmm. What am I going to do, right? I'm not go through the phase? I mean, so you know, you just go. The one caveat I do insist on, though, is when people say, we want to be like Google, careful. Let Google be like Google, and you be like you. So.
Yeah, and of course Google's making money. Big difference.
Well, there's this thing about who knew that search would be a media. Who knew that? This is the GSP, right? Who had a better chance to become the media mogul than the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, right? We didn't think of search as a media, right? We could advertise in libraries. No, we can't. Well, yes, you know, I mean, that's basically what we're doing. I mean, search is a media property, and AdSense is this incredible, you know, media advertising delivery engine, and who knew?